Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. What's going on with the real estate market? It was, I think probably the number one conversation around people's tables on Thanksgiving. It was one of the big questions during the leaders' debate in the last federal election. And I've got an expert on our show tonight to tell us a little bit about what's going on with the real estate market. And we want to focus on some of the problems, what's caused the current lack of affordability, the lack of supply, et cetera, and obviously focus on some of the solutions. And we may get into some of the different and sometimes controversial recommended solutions that may be politically unwise or may make sense. I want to welcome Leor Margulies, a real estate group leader and senior partner at the law firm of Robbins Appleby LLP in Toronto. He specializes in low-rise and high-rise development for both large and mid-sized builders in Ontario, as well as construction financing for most of the major financial institutions in Ontario, and has been on the Build, the board of directors and executive since 1999. Build is the organization that all builders in the Toronto area are members of. Did I pronounce your name right, sir? I apologize.
No problem. No, you're 0 for 2, but that's okay. It's Leor Margulies.
Leor Margulies.
Yeah, exactly. But
welcome.
Good effort.
Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So tell me, what is the problem with the Canadian real estate business?
Well, it depends which way you look at it. From a lot of perspectives, it's not a problem at all. It's a healthy, vibrant industry that's really carried most of the country, and in particular the large urban areas, through COVID, because a lot of industries were shut down right from the get-go, and the provincial governments very wisely kept the construction industries going, both for residential and industrial and commercial, going right through the pandemic. And if you look at the numbers, you can get them from Build, but the numbers are huge. We're probably the number 1 or 2 employer in the country. We probably, I would suspect, exceed the auto industry, which is the sort of poster child for the government. So, when you say it's a problem because, look, housing, there's 2 things people need. They need food, and they need a place to live, and they need a place to work. And, it's not an option to in terms of living space. And Canada is a very attractive country. We're one of the few places people are dying to get into. And we get, I think in Ontario, 300,000 net immigrants a year on average. Maybe the past year and a half, obviously less, but that will change over the next year. And half of them come to GTA. So you have to put those people somewhere. That requires that puts a huge strain on the system to create new housing every year, whether it's low rise, whether it's high rise. So the
quote I heard was that a population the size of the city of Montreal is moving to Toronto in the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's I think the city of Toronto had goals of, we're now, going to 6 or 7 or 8 million people by 31. That's in 10 years. Where are you going to put all these people? And so you have the tremendous demand from the actual living side. You do have a tremendous demand from the investment side, and that's the plus and the minus of the market. It's worldwide, and we're not the only place, but places that are attractive, that are seen as stable and have value and have increasing value. Housing has become an investment. In some cases, I hate to say it, a commodity. So you're getting both local investors and foreign investors viewing housing as a good investment to buy and to hold. And whether or not they get a return on it is sort of less important for a lot of them, because it's safe. If you're coming from Russia or China or Hong Kong or wherever, you buy a house here, it's going to appreciate, the country is stable, your investment will be stable. The fact that you may get a negative return or no return is not as relevant, because quite frankly, to buy a property in any of the major cities, particularly Toronto and Vancouver, you can't get a return, any material return over the cost of the purchase. If you put a mortgage on at 75%, you'll make no, it's a negative. You'd have to put money in every month. But notwithstanding that, it's still seen as very attractive. So you have both the people needing places to live and people wanting to invest, which is creating a huge demand. And that's not going to change. And the problem with a lot of government policies in the past is they focus strictly on the demand side. They try to suppress demand, eliminate foreign buying, eliminate vacant houses, eliminate speculation, raise the qualifications for mortgages that CMHC has done in the past in terms of setting a much higher rate for eligibility. All those things are intended to suppress demand. And they work to a certain extent, but that's artificial. Demand is demand. If we want to have people living here, and people need houses, the real issue is the supply issue. And that's where the solutions will ultimately come. If you can create enough supply that you level out the demand and supply, you'll bring prices down. They won't come down, but you will stop the acceleration. And COVID, of course, made it even worse. You'd think that the market would have crashed. The whole predictions, you go back a year and a half ago, CMHC, Evan Siddall was the CEO. He's very controversial, and if you read any of my blogs, you'll see what I thought of him. He took a very political view of his role as the czar of real estate. He predicted that prices were going to drop by 30% in April of 20. He made these predictions. And of course, what has happened? Prices have gone up 30 to 50 or more percent, depending where you are. Because people need places to live, and people were looking for larger places to live, and they were looking for places outside of little boxes in Toronto. So the 905 areas, the 705 areas, the 519 areas, the prices have dramatically increased. We have a project in Milton, a high-rise project. It's probably, I don't know if it's the first, but there can't be that many high-rise projects in Milton. And it was a project that was priced far too low. It couldn't sustain itself economically in terms of you could build them, but you would lose money. We had to reprice them, and prices went up by almost $100,000 a unit. And we're talking $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. And that doesn't represent huge profits to the builder. That represents making a sort of reasonable return. People keep thinking they see the prices keep going up and builders are making tons of money. Some of them are, but most of them are actually staying pace or actually getting a lesser return.
So you think supply is the issue, not demand? And
suppressing
demand is not in the long term the right solution. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more on the real estate market in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking about the real estate market with, and I'm going to try again to see if I can get it right. Leor Margulies?
Margulies.
Leor Margulies with Robbins Appleby, a law firm in downtown Toronto, and you lead the real estate practice for Robbins Appleby. We were talking about demand and supply, and you were talking about that a lot of the government's efforts have been to suppress demand. Let's talk about that for a little bit if we could. In a lot of markets, when governments try to suppress demand, it ends up actually building up a bubble that ends up becoming even worse later on when the demand floodgates open up again. Some of the policies that they've talked about in regards to suppressing demand are restricting foreigners' investments in property in Canada. Lots of countries worldwide have restrictions on foreigners owning property. What do you think about that? Does that make sense? You know, when you think about all the immigration that you talked about coming to Canada, when you think about all the people in Hong Kong that have had money that want to invest in a second home, sort of an insurance policy in Canada, when you think about Americans that want to own properties in Canada, et cetera, isn't that good for us to have all those people interested in buying property in Canada?
Well, it depends. Every answer has always got a little complexity. If people are buying properties to sit on them, as I said, you get people from, no disrespect, from Hong Kong or other places that are looking for safe havens. They just want to buy their houses, let them sit there. They may come once a year and it sits there. That's taking product out of the marketplace and not really being used for housing and being used strictly as a commodity and for investment. So I'm in favor of that type of restriction. And there's
so that's sort of the vacant property tax.
Right, exactly. That's correct. And I think Vancouver has that. Toronto is talking about that. The Prime Minister in his campaign had two things on the housing. They all had a number of things. That was a big item, if you may recall. Number one was freeze foreign ownership for 2 years. I think that's sort of taking the foreign buyer tax, which is at 15 or 20%, to another dimension. It's a little extreme, and it could dampen construction, because quite frankly, the good side of foreign investment is it does create supply. I mean, all these condo towers in Toronto and in Milton, wherever they are, a lot of them are being fueled by purchases by, let's say, foreigners or investors. There's nothing wrong with that as long as they put them out in the marketplace and people rent them. And that's what's happening. And so if you take that component, if you reduce that component of investment, the problem is until prices come down, people can't afford those units. So where are you going to get the rental supply for those people? To be quite frank, until very recently, and it's changed now that you have purpose-built rentals in GTA, but up till 5 years ago, that was virtually negligible because the return was just not there in terms of the cost to build and the rent. So where was the supply for rental housing coming in Toronto? It was coming from investor-driven projects that would be 70% owned by investors and not tons of foreigners. The foreign component is a misnomer.
So let me challenge you. Let me challenge you there for a second. I've been involved in some real estate condo development, and you're the financing expert. I understand you got to get 75% of the condos sold before you can go out and get the construction financing. And I've heard conversations from developers that say we can't rely on owner-occupied purchases. We need the investors that are going to come in and buy a certain amount of the condos to get up to that minimum amount of condo sales that we need to get the financing. And frankly, the little bit at the end that comes from foreign buyers, we need, because there isn't even enough domestic investors that are going to come in, such that if you remove those foreign investors from buying properties, we might actually not get to that 75% level, and or it'll take longer to get to that level. And so that actually will mean that the condos won't get built and will make the supply issue even worse.
Right. Well, that's exactly, that was my point. You do need investors. And again, I don't think it's so much in foreign investors. They're a small component, but it is investors that are driving those larger projects. And without them, it would take so much longer to sell a project, which will just add cost because if you have a project that takes 2-3 years to sell, you got to carry the land, the marketing, all that adds cost at the end of the day to the unit. So there is some benefit, I think, to having investors investing in units that are rented, that create supply for people. The problem with that process is investors look for the smallest, cheapest unit. They're not looking for 2 or 3 bedroom units. The cost is high, and the return on the rental is
the rental demand is lower.
Right. So they're looking for the 1 bedrooms, the studios. They're the cheapest, and that's what's creating. And there still is a market for that. So that's sort of skewering the market. So that's not so good in terms of creating a broad base of supply for people. The problem is the larger units are too expensive for the average, first-time buyer to buy. 1,000 square feet, which would be not a huge, in the old days, that wouldn't be considered large.
1,000 square feet is huge in today's market.
I know, that's like a 4-bedroom apartment. Exactly. Well, that's going to cost you well over, even in the Milton market, it's going to cost you well over $1 million. In the Toronto market, it's going to cost you $1.5 million. Well, how many first-time buyers can afford $1 million, $1.5 million for their first home? So they buy, just like my daughter-in-law. They bought their first, her and her boyfriend bought their first unit. It's a resale. It's actually quite large. I was very impressed. 720 square feet at Yonge and Eglinton, one of the first tall Minto buildings, beautiful building, for under 700. So that was like 900 a square foot. I was actually thrilled that they got something decent for 900.
Under $1 million.
Under $1 million. And the thing is that the new product is all coming out at 1,300 a foot and up to 2,000. And that's the problem. But the investors aren't the problem in the market. The problem is.
So we also hear about this new CMHC regulations, which what do? They increase the interest rate in a stress test. Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, you have for qualifying on bank finance mortgages, you have to have an income level that I think don't quote me, it's like, 30% of the house carrying cost has to be covered by your income, principal, mortgage, interest, and taxes. But they don't use the actual rate of interest that you are getting on your mortgage, which right now is very low. You can get floating rate mortgages for for prime less 1.3, which is about 115, 120 floating, and fixed are 2% for 5 years. Well, they're adding, I think, 2.5% to that. They're saying you have to, you take the 5-year, we don't care what mortgage you take. You have to take the 5-year rate, which is the highest rate, and add 2 points to that. And then you have to qualify. And there's some merit to that, to saying, well, what happens when interest rates rise? If your income hasn't gone up, will you be able to carry this mortgage? So they want to know that people can not only carry it today, because people stretch themselves right to the limit, but in 3 to 5 years, when your mortgage may come due, will you be able to carry a mortgage that's gone up by at least 2 points at the higher end? So that puts that eliminated a lot of first-time buyers that didn't meet that test. They could carry the mortgage now at 2, they couldn't carry it at 4.
So does that decrease demand?
Yes.
Or does it make people move a little bit farther out of the city so that they can actually afford the house and or downscale their expectations, or frankly, make them go get more money from mom and dad or from second mortgages and third mortgages?
It's a combination of all those things. They do move out to the 905s, but of course, in the COVID, everyone wanted to move to 905. Nobody wanted to be here. They all wanted a bigger space. They could work at home. So if they were sitting in Coburg working for the bank, it didn't matter. But then, of course, if you look at the price increases since April of 20 to now, and the 905 versus 416, the prices have been staggering out there, and in 519. Versus 416 has gone up. I don't know the exact percentages, but the 51 areas outside of Toronto have been quite substantial. So yes, that's part of it. And yes, the bank of mom and dad is helpful, is almost necessary if you're in 416. And that's not so bad, because mom and dad have created this wealth in their own housing, right? You know, their houses are now, you know, they bought for, you know, 600,000, they're now worth 3.5 million. Well, you know what, they can borrow against that, or they have enough money to advance. That's the only way people can buy in 416. There's no children under the age of 30 have been able to generate enough of a deposit. If they do the CMHC, it helps because it's 5 or 10% deposit. But even still, it's challenging. There's no question. And this is the challenges that you're facing around the world. You go to London, Paris, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago. It's the same issue. So, you know, the cost is making it very high. And we haven't even talked about, you know, what else is driving cost here, and what can we do to help? Really, that's, you know, we know there's a problem.
Okay, so I hear like lumber prices are up like 150, 250, 300%, some people are saying.
Well, okay, so construction costs since COVID have gone up dramatically across the board. In fact, lumber, yes, you're right, it doubled, tripled. It actually has come down. So it's still higher, but it's come way down. It's dropped by half from the peaks. It still doesn't make it affordable, but it's construction cost and it's construction supply. COVID has broken the supply chain lines from China to the US. Anything out of the US is a complete disaster. You try and get appliances out of the US, you can be waiting a year. I had a builder that's got a project on right downtown Toronto, a very big builder, and they're finishing off the building, and they needed the little sleeves. Again, I'm no expert. The little sleeves that carry the wires that are embedded in the walls, right? So they can't get them. They can't get them. So they had to cannibalize other projects that were earlier in the stage of construction, steal them from there, so they could finish off the other project down here, a couple of blocks from where I live. I mean, it's crazy. So that's so construction costs, no question, is a huge issue, and some builders are looking at building in escalation clauses in their purchase agreements. I do a lot of them. I haven't drafted one yet, but they're saying, look, I go to market, the prices are X. By the time I start building, even if it's low rise, they're now 2X. You know, I'm losing money. So you may start seeing that in the marketplace, that purchasers are going to be asked to absorb some of the extra cost. So construction costs are number one, but there's a whole slew of other issues, and the biggest one that the governments have pay lip service to, with all due respect to whether they're Liberal, Conservative, NDP, is the approval process.
Okay, so we're going to talk about supply issues in just a minute after the break. So let's hold on that one. Sure. But let me ask you, what's this whole blind bidding issue?
Okay, so that's sort of a different issue to equalize the process, and that's on the resale side. And does that really impact on pricing? It may. It certainly creates an unfairness, because now in the process in Toronto, and I've seen it with my son, with my daughter-in-law, with everybody. You put your product on the market. Let's say it's a house, and let's say the market right now, no one knows what the market is because it's moving so rapidly. It's, that market is 1.3 million. That's sort of the right price. So what agents are doing, they're pricing it not at 1.3, they're pricing it 1.1. Or maybe a 999. They're pricing it well below the right price. They're setting a date for offers. They're saying, okay, you can come and look at it all week this week, and next Monday, at 6 o'clock, you submit your offers, and then so you're doing a blind bid. You have no idea what you're not negotiating with the vendor. You're not giving them an offer and they come back and forth, and that's that's sort of the classic way. No, you're putting in a bid. So you're saying, okay, I know it's worth 1.3. I know it's a hot market. I've tried for 10 houses already that I've lost. So I'll put it in 1.4. That's the way I'll get it. Or put it in 1.45. You're picking a number out of a hat to say, what will it be that I'll beat all the other guys? You're bidding against all these people, but you have no idea what their pricing is. And that could, in fact, be elevating prices on the resale side, because you're not going to underbid it unless the market softens. Right now, the market's hot. So it's 1.3. The fact that they put it in $1 million is irrelevant. So you want to get that house. And people are frustrated, right? They bid on other houses. They went, and this is the 10th house. The agent says, look, you want this house? It's not going to go for less than 1.3. And if you really want it, you got to put in an extra 50 or 100. So you're blind bidding. So you're inflating the price, number one. That's unfair. Number two, you may not get a mortgage based on that, because the bank may say, oh, you paid 1.5. That's nice. We've done appraisals in the area. Your house is worth 1.3. So we're going to give you 75% of 1.3. And then suddenly the purchaser says, excuse me, where am I going to get the extra 200? So blind bidding, I find is actually obnoxious.
So what's the justification for it? Why is it there? You think about the stock market, you get prices on a millisecond basis. You think about the grocery store, you go in, you see what the price is. Right. You go to an art auction, you know what the last bid is. What's the justification for blind bidding in the real estate market?
Well, the justification is agents like it. They get their prices juiced up, which means they get a bigger commission. Vendors like it in a hot market. They like it because they get the best possible price, well beyond their expectations. For a purchaser, it's terrible. And the government's been talking, finally, Trudeau, although I don't see this as a federal jurisdiction, I see it as a provincial jurisdiction, blind bidding. I don't know how he's going to regulate it, but he said, I'm going to get rid of blind bidding. He didn't say what he's going to substitute it with. They have it in Australia. Australia has a nice, clean, I'm not saying there are problems with it because I haven't examined it, but Australia has a nice, clean system. You have a house, you set your purchase agreement is standard, it's there. So all you're going to do is maybe fill in the closing date and the price. And everybody goes down the block. They all stand outside, and there's Brian standing out there. I got this lovely house. You've all looked at it. You've had your inspections. Here's the inspection report. What do I hear? Minimum bid is $1 million, $1.1 million, $1.2 million. So then, at least if you're bidding, you know what
auction.
It's an auction. So maybe it'll be higher actually if you have a real. I don't know. So that's sort of the classic way to do it.
But the other big issue that I think is actually the true biggest issue is supply, and the lack of supply and government regulation and timing to get approvals. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more. And we're going to talk about what these supply issues are and what we could possibly do to address them. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Leor Margulies, who is with Robbins Appleby. He's the top lawyer in the real estate area, specializing in mid-rise and high-rise construction, financing, et cetera. And he's written a lot about the real estate market and what's going on. And sir, I read a couple of things that you've written, and you're very critical of the government and its lack of approvals, the time it takes to get approvals, municipalities, and how slow they are to increase their zoning towards the places to go legislation and other provincial guidelines in regards to density. Supply is an issue. What what can we possibly do to solve it?
Well, I mean, the answer is there. And in fact, I was at a build function last Thursday and Premier Ford showed up and he spoke almost off the cuff. I was actually very impressed with him. And he nailed it. He said, you know, it's not, it's supply and it's the approval process. So, I mean, for instance, I'll give you an example. I use Milton. I have a client that had bought land for development in 2004. It finally, this is low rise. It finally got all the approvals and the services and everything ready to go so that houses could be built in 2015. So that means they held on to this land for 10 years. And it wasn't like long time. It was ready to start moving. That's how long it takes to take land from greenfield to construction. So if you look at the cost of that, the carrying cost, it's huge. And no small builders can do it. So you're actually getting a concentration in that area of low rise of big builders who have enough capital to withstand it. It shouldn't take 10 years to get through approvals. You have a provincial system, like there are so many ministries that have to go through a process and there's no control. There's no control on them, how long it takes the Ministry of Natural Resources, Ministry of Transportation, Environment. The regulation is huge. And if you look at the Wynne government that was in here for a long time, I counted once, if you look at one of my blogs, I think about, and this was off the top of my head, I came up with 15 pieces of legislation aimed strictly at regulating the real estate industry in Ontario. So every regulation is going to add cost and time. And I could never figure out, were we so bad that we had to be regulated more than any other industry? But that's a huge problem. The government has to find a way to streamline things. And that's at the provincial level. And that's more the low-rise side. In the city side, it's you have your building to go through a process of zoning, site plan, and every other department. And you go through, every approval goes through 10 departments in the city. And it's not like you're supposed to have one quarterback in the city running the show. It should be the planning department and they go back to everybody else and get their input. But the way it really works is planning in Toronto is understaffed, overloaded, and has no incentive to be fast or creative. Now, that's the problem with all of the government systems. In private practice, if you get your development fast through, you come up with a great idea, you save your boss money, you make money, you get promoted, you get a pat on the back. As a government official, you don't get any credit for being smart or fast or helpful or putting through, oh, you put through 4 developments this year and the average was 2. We're going to give you a raise. No, you don't get to, but if you make a mistake, if you go outside of the box, you get slapped. So there's no incentive in the system for creativity. And that's the problem. And to be honest, the development side, no matter what the government say, and Ford said he's going to cut the red tape. He's going to cut the red tape in the city. I wish him the best of luck. It hasn't happened. Every government has said that, and it's never happened.
We seem to have more red tape in the real estate industry than in almost any other industry.
Correct.
Why is it? Is it just that local governments want to get involved and justify their existence, or is it NIMBYism that local councillors need to have that control because otherwise they won't get elected? What's the justification for it?
Well, it's a mix. Look, housing is...
Or is every developer a bad designer? And so therefore we need to have smart planning people that can do a better job of designing and architecting and telling them how many parking spaces they need and tell them what the outside of the building's got to look like and where the park's got to be. Like they have more influence on every aspect of development than you would in almost any other product market.
They do. Like I said, look at those 15 pieces of legislation that Wynne put through, and the City of Toronto is no different. Look, it's housing, right? It's very important where people live and how it looks and how it fits together. So, government intervention to a certain extent is important. It's not the developers who are creating these. You look at a lot of the buildings, you say, oh, they all look the same. There's no ingenuity. There's no creativity. In a lot of cases, that's true. It's not their fault. They are straitjacketed by the planning department that has like a myopic vision of how things are to happen. You have to have a base of on the bottom that spreads out, that's supposed to have retail commercial, even in areas that don't need retail commercial. You have a tower that goes on top. They have a fear of height. quite frankly, that's where we can affect supply, both supply for regular people and supply for affordable housing, people that are at a lower income levels. You can create more supply by building taller and nicer, because once you get above 30, 40 stories, it doesn't make a difference whether it's 30 or 40 or 60. We have had fights with the municipality over 6 versus 7 stories or 7 versus 8. It's ridiculous. And you could spend a year. You go to the LPAT, the board that has, thank God we have a board in Ontario that adjudicates zoning issues. The only board, I think, in the world where you can contest a municipal decision on zoning. Everywhere else, you got to make your deal, pay your money, do whatever, you take out the counselor. Here, you can go to the board, and the board will look at planning principles and say, for that area, for this type of area, you can build this more. That's the only safety valve we have. But the municipal system in Toronto is utterly broken because of the ward system.
The municipal system is broken because of the ward system.
That's right. Because Toronto basically has one mayor and 45 fiefdoms. Think of a feudal Europe, where you had the king at the top, then you had the 20 lords that paid homage to him, but they had their own little fiefdoms. They hired their own armies, and they run their own little countries. And that's what happens in each ward. Because if you're a developer and you have an idea for a proposal, you have to sell it to that councillor. And if you can't get past that councillor, even because the councillor has, ward issues, NIMBYism is a huge problem, you can't get past them. And none of the other councillors, even if they think that makes sense from a city perspective, that building at Yonge and Eglinton, Yonge and Duplex, it makes sense to put up 20 stories. But we're not going to go against Councillor so-and-so, because that's his ward. Because when I have a problem, I want to be able to call the shots. So you have 44 warlords here.
So no one's making decisions other than the mayor on the benefit of all of Toronto. Everyone's making decisions only for their local little fiefdom.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there is input, but at the end, they will go against the planning department. We've had situations where the planning department is on sync with a developer for a particular development, and the councillor says, no, my group, I don't like it. Go to the board. He loves the problem is they love sending things to the board, because then the board makes the decision. And then if they approve this big development, he can go to his constituents and say, hey, I fought for you guys. We lost, but I tried. Even if in his heart, he knows it's the right thing. And that's why that is really backwards. We don't look at the city as a whole, the area as a whole. People want to live where they like. There's no more room in Toronto. So it can either go up or spread out a little bit in townhouses. But you can't leave everything exact. And yes, we're not going to put a high rise in the middle of the upper Forest Hill Village. But on the other hand, you should be able to build on Eglinton. You should be built on the intersections. You should be building a transit. And that's what Ford has been pushing for. And the city has, anyways.
I had
it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating.
I had a planner come in and tell me that the current zoning and official plans in the Greater Toronto area are like 50 to 70% of the density that's been identified in provincial legislation, like the Places to Go legislation. In other words, official plans and the actual zoning doesn't keep anywhere up to speed with where we actually identify provincially we need density to go if we're going to actually be able to build enough housing.
Well, that's the one area. I think the city of Toronto is better, to be honest. We've met our targets because we're heavy density here. So that's not a big issue. But once you get outside of 416 and a lot of municipalities, they're not following the provincial guidelines, which is the one thing Wynne did, right or wrong, she decided we can't have sprawl. We have to intensify where we have built up areas. And a lot of these municipalities aren't changing their official plans to recognize that. So they're forcing developers to fight them every inch of the way because they're working with outdated official plans and zoning. And that's one thing the province could do. They could come back and say, force the municipalities to join the wagon of density.
Well, they've been doing a little bit with these ministerial orders, which I guess is where the Minister of Housing can actually override some of the rules that local cities are putting in place. Is that not the case?
They've done that very sparingly, and very usually in situations where the municipalities have you have a development that straddles two municipalities, so they get the province to do it. It's rare. It's happened, but it's rare that the province will step in and override the city. They've done it with the ministerial zoning order. They did it with another order at Yonge and Eglinton and downtown. The province overrode. They had a choice in one situation to either approve a zoning from the city, which was very restrictive at Yonge and Eglinton, which is now the core of transit, right? Yonge and Eglinton. Now you have the crossroads. They reduced heights to like 15 or 30 meters. It was ridiculous. So it had to go back to the province for approval under a particular Planning Act provision. There was no appeal. The city had gone through a process that there was no appeal to the LPAT for the developers, but it had to be approved by the province. And they did this unwittingly, or they didn't think about it, right during the provincial election. So when they started, Wynne was in power, and they figured she would just rubber stamp it, which she would have. But by the time it was done, it was July after the election, it came to Ford and Clark, and they had an option to approve it, send it back, or put in their own. And they had input from the development industry, from consumer groups, and 7 months later, we had a whole new zoning which expanded it. But that's rare. Unfortunately, that's very rare.
We're chatting about the real estate market. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Leor Margulies, head of real estate legal work at Robbins Appleby LLP, a law firm in Toronto. Leor, in the leadership debate, in the federal leadership debate, the question was asked, what's the solution with housing? Because you seem to have two very different attitudes. Clearly, the lack of affordability is impacting first-time buyers. But you've got all these people that have built up massive net worth. And if you actually reduce prices, you're going to destroy their net worth, bring it down. What is the solution? Is this current high prices actually good for people? Because people like me might actually have a nice house and built up some net worth, but a whole bunch of people like my sons and daughters can never get in.
Look, that's the dichotomy here in terms of the haves and the have-nots. The people who live in the nice areas don't want density. The people who live in nice houses don't want their prices to come down. I think we have to slow the increase, the rate of increase of prices, and we have to create supply. And the supply is across the board. And one thing where there is a supply is in city-owned lands. The city owns tons of property that they promised to build housing. It's stuck, and that's a whole other topic. The province has tons of surplus lands. Those lands could be made affordable in proper joint ventures with private developers. And you have to streamline the development process. If you talk to any developer, he said, you streamline the process. And I've told the city, I said, charge a premium for moving up an approval through faster. They'll pay it because time is money. And if we can reduce time by a year, 2 years in approvals, that's huge in financing costs, and that will be passed on. One thing you got to remember, and this one, I don't have the answer. Probably in an average condo in Toronto, in terms of total taxes, that's HST, development charges, park levies, you name it, building permit fees, is close to $200,000. So before you blink, I think it was 165, and that was 2 years ago. So before you blink on your condo, you're paying 165 to some government agency. Well, maybe we can look at reducing those costs somehow and making sure that they get passed on. I mean, that's the other thing. That would help. And they've
politicians and the public seem to always, blame rich developers. Sounds to me like you think it's government that's the problem here.
Look, developers are in business. So, they're not, they are philanthropists, don't get me wrong. If you look at the money they give, but let's park that. They're looking to build housing and community where they get a reasonable profit. And if they get that reasonable return of 10, 11% on their capital, they're happy. So they want to create good product. And so both affordable and quality stuff that will last, that when people drive by and say, great, that's a beautiful building. You can't do that in Toronto. It's too expensive, and the planning principles are so restrictive. We can talk about that. There's things that they could do on the planning side that would allow greater density. The 25-meter setback between buildings. That's crazy. 75 feet you can't build. So then if you have a lot, you've lost 75 feet on your property. All kinds of things, particularly for affordable housing. If you look at the city properties, they're still applying where they want to build cheaper housing for people at lower incomes. They're applying the same restrictive principles. How dumb is that?
Leor Margulies, Leor Margulies,
Yes.
Robbins Appleby. Thank you so much for joining us, telling us about the real estate market. We're going to have you back because this has been a fascinating conversation. That's our show for tonight, everyone. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 9:60 a.m. at 6 p.m. Please join us again. Good night, everybody.